This allows me to introduce Dorothée Vandamme. Dorothée is working at the Catholic University of Louvain-de-la-Neuve. That's the French-speaking university in Leuven in Belgium. And she's also a researcher at the Center for the Study of Crisis and International Conflicts, and a fellow at the Genesis Network. On top of that, she's also an EFSAS research fellow. And as I already said, Dorothée will elaborate more upon the role of the Pakistani army in sponsoring terrorism in South Asia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the faculty and EFSAS for organizing this event and for inviting me to talk here. Can everybody hear me? Okay? Okay. So, my presentation, I've decided to take a step back from strictly speaking about the military, and I'll be talking about the more general radicalization process in Pakistan. Of course, I will be talking about the military, but just wanted to point that out. So the first thing that I wanted to mention here, and it's because we are in a university, so I allow myself a little conceptual detour in my presentation. What exactly are we talking about? The name of the panel of the conference is Terrorism in South Asia, and the name of my presentation is Radicalization. And that's already a first difference that is important to make. So before I make this point, I would just like to point out the relative nature of those concepts. There are radicals and there are radicals. What do I mean by that? I mean by that we have different perceptions here about what is a radical or what is a terrorist than what they have in South Asia. By our standards, by Western standards, we will see some person as being radical in Afghanistan or Pakistan. And they, in the countries, they don't see themselves as radicals, or the population will not see them as radicals. So that is one point that is important to keep in mind when we tackle this subject. What does that mean? That means that we have a different way of seeing the level, the line that one crosses to get into this category of being radical. So a radical is someone, very broadly, who has reached the stage of readiness to engage in illegal and violent political action. It's different from an activist, obviously, but important to note. How is it different? An activist usually engages in legal and non-violent political action. So the activist can become a radical can become an activist if he disengages from violence. That's radicals. The terrorist is a label that we've been using for an incredible number of people, of groups, especially since 9/11. And we've been using it also in comparison or sometimes as a synonym to freedom fighters. It's actually a question that I get from my students a lot. What's the difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist? Well, one of my answers is different nature. A terrorist is someone who engages in actions through terror. It's pretty basic. Terrorism is in fact a means of political violence to reach a political objective. A freedom fighter, we call freedom fighters those that we perceive as fighting for freedom, or those who define themselves as fighting for freedoms. So it designates the end result. Now, why am I talking about that? Because I've making my presentation here, I wanted to make clear what I was going to talk about. I'm not talking about terrorism in Pakistan, I'm talking about radicalization, the process through which some people in Pakistan actually decide to engage in political violence to reach their objectives. Not all radicals become terrorists. And radicalization studies have started to grow, especially because after 9/11 started to develop the terrorism studies. with the objective to understand the root causes of terrorism. And at some point it kind of became politically incorrect to do that, because it felt to some that terrorism studies, by doing that, was trying to justify the violence used by terrorists. And so it became labeled as the radicalization studies. They more or less do the same. So radicalization is, by excellence, a context-based phenomenon. It's a process, and that's important when you talk about counter-radicalization or de-radicalization. You have to understand it as a context, as a process. Sorry, it's global, it's sociological, it's political in its drivers, but it's also psychological and ideological, which means you have to look at all those facets to really understand the process, the phenomenon that you're trying to understand. So let's focus now on Pakistan itself. There are three levels that we can look at to understand this radicalization process in Pakistan. The micro level, which means focusing on the individual. The meso level, the radicalized social milieu. And the macro level, government and society at large, and what their impact is in terms of radicalization. So let's look here at the macro level, so the individual level in Pakistan. There are different factors that will explain radicalizations throughout the country. And if you really want to understand it, you actually have to look at the local context. In terms of identity, for example, Pakistani identity is far from simple, it's far from being homogeneous, okay? So you have the Pashtun identity, which has become a rallying point for radicalization. You have the Baloch identity, which is also becoming very, very strongly a factor of radicalization. Where's the Pakistani identity in that? That's the question. And those that radicalize at the local level that much, they actually distantiate themselves from Pakistani identity. They don't recognize itself as Pakistani anymore. And they take on the fight because they want to assert their local ethnic identity against the Pakistani state, most of the time. It's also the result of failed integration by these individuals. If you look at, for example, the special status of the federally administered tribal areas throughout the years, but since the country actually came in existence, it was an inheritance from the British Empire. Until actually the middle of this year, well, there was this merger with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But even if you look at that merger, it's not exactly complete reintegration of the Fatah in the country. If you're interested in that particular element, there's an excellent article in The Dawn, the Pakistani newspaper, that actually explains what this is about. But that has been actually something that a lot of political scientists have looked at, is this special status of the Fatah, because it is a factor for the Pashtun population to feel disenfranchised from the government, because they don't have the same rights as other Pakistani citizens. In terms of failed integration, if you look at Balochistan, there has been very recently a terrorist attack against the Chinese embassy. And the fact that the Baloch population is not profiting from the CPEC project is one element to understand why these attacks happen. The fact that the government is not listening to the Baloch population, it's not listening to their claims and their demands, and they feel alienated from the state. One major driver of radicalization in the country, in those regions, is the fact that Pakistan is being governed by the Punjabi population. And the army, even if it has been changing in the past decade or so, the army was predominantly from Punjab. So the rest of the population didn't feel represented by the government and by the military. Then you got the feelings of humiliation that come on top of that. Those feelings that a lot of Muslim population have felt, especially since the 9/11 attacks, having to justify themselves, having to prove that they're the good ones, not the bad ones. And those feelings of humiliation, they have played a large role in Pakistan in terms of alienating the population also from the West. A personal anecdote is that when I was in Pakistan, I was systematically put as the representative of the West. And during the interviews, during the conversation that I was having with Pakistanis, almost systematically, they would kind of really put me in that role. I was a representative of the West. I was, you do that and you do that. I don't do that. Washington did that. I didn't really. But it's just an example to show the feeling of resentment that has grown more and more. And because the government, because the military collaborates with Western countries, that creates resentment against their own national institutions as well. If you combine all of that with some moral outrage, feelings of rejection, stigmatization, the problem of accessing the job market, the lack of economic opportunities, you get a pretty good idea about the kind of drivers at the individual level that can bring someone to radicalize. Again, as I said, radical does not mean terrorist. The meso level, so that's the wider social environment, the wider radical environment, which kind of serves as the rallying point. So it's the level that will sort of catch the person when the radicalization process has started. And it's the new social environment around which the individual will build him or herself. In Pakistan, there is an important role that the family has to play in that. One particular group that's very interesting to look at in terms of family support is Lashkar-e-Taiba, because it is seen by the family as a privilege, as an honor to have one of their children, one of their sons, usually it's the men, go to fight with Lashkar-e-Taiba. Why? Because they fight against India, against the great enemy. And the family plays an active role in that sense. So it's sort of a social prestige for the family, for social surroundings, which of course will be emphasized by the economic opportunities that those fighters can get. Trying to get money to their families. That's the way to do it. The fact that there are radical groups pretty much all over the country doesn't really help, obviously, because there's an easy access to the population. When you go to Lahore, you know that there are some terrorist groups everywhere, headquarters of those terrorist groups everywhere, for example. There are some parts of the country where it's not exactly safe to go because those groups are so well embedded in the population. And I wanted to show that, that graph. So by Madiha Afzal, so she wrote this book, Pakistan Under Siege, which I really highly recommend if you're interested in this problematic. And she did that graph resulting from an interview question by the Pew Research Center. The question was, do you personally feel that kind of violence, such as suicide bombings and other forms of political violence against civilian targets, is justified to defend Islam? Is it often justified, sometimes justified, rarely justified, or never justified? So that's the result of this survey. What you can see, so the sample was between, depending on where they were in the region and depending on the year, it was between 1,500 and 2,000 approximately. An important point is that it was mostly in urban areas because the Pew Research Center does not carry out surveys in places that are too insecure. And there was no survey in 2003 and 2012, so they just basically connected the dots for those 2 years. What I wanted to point out here is that very clearly the majority says it's not justified, it's never justified. But very clearly we're in urban settings. And urban settings are pretty much everywhere the more liberal ones, the more moderate ones. And the fact is that we don't have a lot of data about rural settings in Pakistan. And those that do are mostly local NGOs who work on these issues and who have access to the field. And those NGOs point out the role of the families and the fact that those families, they see this action as justified. At the macro level, so that's the role of the government and society, both at home and abroad. There has been a radicalization of public opinion and of party politics, especially what we have seen in the last elections is the very important presence of radical Islamist parties that have actually gained a lot of platform to speak up. When we talk about government and society at large in the case of Pakistan, it's difficult not to come back on the Zia-ul Haq's years because of the Islamization process that he started, his Islamization policy. So Zia was between 78 and 88. An important element, for example, to give you as an example, is the promulgation of the 1986 blasphemy laws, the one that we still see consequences of that. But more generally, it radicalized the population in terms of Islamicizing, I don't even know if that's a word, but I think you understand what I mean, Islamicizing the country, the policies, but also the general mind and the society at large. Such examples as the Tasir case, but most recently the Asia Bibi case. Examples of those, the consequences of those blasphemy laws. There's also the role of legal and educational institutions that should be taken into account. Those have fostered a hatred for ethnic and religious minorities, an antipathy toward the West, and since 1947, antipathy towards India. And in that level, the military has played an incredibly important role in facilitating the access of radical groups to politics. First, their effort to differentiate the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. More generally, they're sponsoring, assisting, and actively or passively supporting some radical groups that are understood as not terrorists, but strategic assets. Lashkar-e-Taiba being an example. So, military fighting the TTP, but supporting Lashkar-e-Taiba. And since 2016-17, the military has been engaged in a new policy of mainstreaming terrorists into traditional politics, to dilute their influence and attempt to reduce their violence. The idea is just to try and disengage them from violence, which does not work. Let's be clear about that. Well, the problem doesn't make them less radical just because you give them a platform, an official platform to talk. The second is it actually give them an entry into mainstream politics and a greater platform to communicate their radical ideas. So it actually creates the risk of further radicalization, of increasing radicalization in the country. And even not only the military, but even Imran Khan himself has turned a new streak by having a much stronger stance on Islam and the role of religion in a country. So, facing these elements, what exactly can we do, or what exactly can be done in terms of countering radicalization or de-radicalizing? Well, first thing is understanding those two programs as being different. Countering radicalization programs, we tend to focus on those vulnerable individuals. So those programs are usually carried out by NGOs, local NGOs that know the population, that have access to the population, trying to reach out to the families where they feel that there is a vulnerable individual, to try and get that family to understand that there should be another way to go, not radicalize that individual. The problem is, how do we identify them, and then what do we do? In 2013, I was in DC and I met the director of one of those programs who was trying in the Fatah to go to the families, trying to identify those individuals and get them back into a normal path, let's say. And she said something to me that really struck me, is that sometimes she would enter the family and start talking with the family, sometimes even with the individual himself, and she knew that there was nothing she could do. That the radicalization had gone so far that there was basically no going back. And this is something that we actually have seen also in Western Europe with the increase of terrorist threats and the terrorist attack that there have been. There have been increased effort in de-radicalization, and we have seen the limits of those programs. So this is something that really is important to focus on, because clearly we don't have the keys yet as to what exactly can be done to de-radicalize. One of the most fundamental drivers of countering radicalization is education. So in Pakistan, you can broadly see three branches of education. You got the public one, the private one, and the religious one. And we tend, especially in the West, we tend to associate radicalization with the religious education system. And that's a very incomplete picture. And if you want to tackle education for countering radicalization, you have to go in particular to the public system. Why? Because it has to be deconstructed to really basically get the facts straight. The textbooks, the way that they carry the history of Pakistan, the way they tell about the events that happened that created Pakistan and afterwards, basically puts Pakistan as the victim of India. And if you don't deconstruct that idea, then you don't deconstruct the very basic idea that serves as platform for radicalization. So in terms of education, there is massive work to do in Pakistan. And finally, and I will finish on that point, jobs. Having economic opportunities, that is a factor that will help counter radicalization. But it's not that simple. Some analysts have tended to just focus on jobs as the key to stop radicalization. And yet we have seen that in Pakistan there is a growing middle class, but that middle class, with its new wealth, has actually invested in its religious fervor. For example, in their children's religious education, or in building mosques, or in Islamic charities. So those elements have to all be taken into account, with the very key point that I started in my presentation here is understanding exactly what we deal with is the most important point. Thank you.